Eliana, how different is it for you covering this administration and this Washington versus what came before?
Well, in all fairness, I was trying to think how to answer your question because I didn't cover the Obama administration. I was covering Republican House and Senate campaigns. But I think for me, having come out of cable news, there's sort of a natural transition because Trump isn't somebody who goes up to his residence every night. He's not LBJ working the phones and calling Republican and Democratic lawmakers trying to get a deal done. He is somebody who goes up to his residence and he's calling cable news hosts, trying to adjust the news coverage or talk about lighting and camera angles. I mean, really, that's what he does. And so he's very much, he's a media president. And when his aides come to him, traditionally you think about the presidency and the job of presidential aides is, when they're writing memos, is they're trying to come to the president and show the president policy alternatives, option A, option B, option C. I had members of the Bush administration tell me that their meetings with the president would be, he wanted to watch his cabinet members or their aides debate the various options, and he would ask them questions. Defend A, defend B, what about this with A? Trump doesn't like that. He asks his aides to present him one option and then tell them how they think it's going to be covered in the media. And so I think the main difference with Trump is that he views everything through the lens of media coverage. Everything to him is a media problem, and his friends and the people he likes to bounce ideas off of are a part of the media infrastructure in a way that I don't think we've really ever seen before.
David, you joked to me before, just before we were coming in, that you've been covering Washington since the administration of Andrew Jackson.
The second term.
Oh, okay. Fair point. I apologize. What's your reaction to the way this administration functions and appears versus others?
I think in a way we always say that an administration or a president is different from what came before. There's only been 44 of them. We call him the 45th president, but Grover Cleveland was elected twice, but not in order. They're all different. And this one is an amalgamation of a lot of figures in American political life. A little bit of Huey Long, who was the Louisiana kingfish in the 30s, a little bit of, I think, a little bit of Henry Ford, a little bit of Charles Lindbergh, a little bit of William Jennings Bryan. Some names you may know, some names you may not, but these were populists of the 19th and 20th century. But really, he's most like Donald Trump. And sometime, 30 years from now, 32 years from now, someone will say, well, President so-and-so has a little bit of Donald Trump and a little bit of so-and-so. They're all different, and they've only had 44 of them, and they have a right to be regarded as originals. And this guy is the ultimate American original, I would say.
So another thing we were talking about backstage was why this administration seems to leak so much, and seems, from my impression, to leak more than other administrations. So, Eliana, talk a bit about what your thoughts on that.
I reserve the right to let David correct me, who covered the Clinton administration. I was asking you a little bit about that backstage, but my sense is that the people who served in the Obama administration, the people who served in the George W. Bush administration, you talk to them now and they remain tremendously loyal to Barack Obama and what he was trying to get accomplished. People who I know who worked for George W. Bush, they love George W. Bush. They have tremendous respect for him. And I think they felt when they were working in the White House that they were working toward a larger goal that was embodied by the president that they worked for, and they were disciplined in the way they related to the press because they felt that they were working toward a larger goal set forth by the president. I don't think that that's the same. With Trump, I think there's some haziness when it comes to what the administration is working toward, what Trump himself stands for, and the only people I think that he knows are truly loyal to him in that sense in the White House are his family members. And the rest of the people there, I don't think feel that way about him because it's unclear what larger cause they're marching in lockstep toward. And so I think people are very quick. There are Reince Priebus people in the White House. There are Steve Bannon people in the White House. I don't think there's a larger sense that we are all Trump people.
Yeah, I wanted to add to this that in Washington, you can walk down the street or go to lunch, and Eliana, you've had this experience, I'm sure, and they'll say, oh, there's so-and-so. He was a Johnson guy, and he was a Jack guy, Jack Kennedy. And the Jack guys were different from the Bobby guys, Bobby Kennedy. And, oh, so-and-so, he was a Carter guy or a Reagan guy. I don't think anyone will ever say that so-and-so is a Trump guy, and except Trump himself. And he most assuredly is a Trump guy. But I think that in our history most recently, people have identified and fallen in love with the people they've worked for, and they've lent their identities to that person and to his larger cause. The Lyndon Johnson people are a great example. And I think, as Eliana said, that this is not an administration with a philosophy so much as a slogan, make America great again. It doesn't have a program, it has a notion they want to win. So, I mean, Lyndon Johnson had, from the very day he was inaugurated on the tarmac in Dallas in 1963, he knew exactly what he wanted to do and what he wanted the Johnson legacy to be. It didn't include the word Vietnam, but he knew something. We had, and I won't go on too much longer, but we had the new freedom. We had the new freedom of Wilson, the new nationalism of Teddy Roosevelt, the New Deal, the Fair Deal. There's no slogan here that makes any sense that is of an overarching nature.
Adrian, you got anything you want to add to that? And then again, in the contrast between Queen's Park, loyalty, leaking, and Washington today.
We talk about Queen's Park in Pittsburgh every day. I can't imagine why you were so disinterested.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly thought when I covered Queen's Park that the Ontario Liberals were undisciplined about leaking, where they were very, and I was covering at the same time that Stephen Harper was in power federally, and federally there was so much sort of message discipline around Stephen Harper that it felt like covering the Ontario Liberals, you were sort of with the kind of old school political types, right, where you were, everybody wanted to go to lunch, everybody wanted to go for drinks, everybody wanted to gossip on, off the record kind of thing. But at the same time, it was an order of magnitude smaller than what we've seen in Washington, and the amount of, I remember once like struggling for a good couple of weeks to put together sort of the behind the scenes TikTok of how the Ontario Liberals pulled off the 2014 election campaign. And it was a bit of like this sort of, constantly phoning people, trying to get, different details and try to confirm stuff. For ultimately what was for the Liberals a positive story, right? Because it was about how they won and if there's ever a situation where people want to brag to you either on or off the record about their achievements, that would be the one. That still took a good couple of weeks to pull together. You look at Washington now, and it's like within 24 hours, or less than that, within 12 hours, you've got the entire TikTok of how James Comey's firing went down, who was yelling at who in the back room, the amazing detail of the president sitting up in the residence watching CNN and getting upset that Spicer wasn't there, so ordering him out of the bushes. These sorts of crazy things, these sort of amazing, juicy details that it's like in a normal political beat, you fight to get them, and it seems now, in the White House, like they just pour out.
And let's make it clear, leaks are good. We love them.
For us, they are. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a source of information.
The final thing I would add is that because Trump is so much of a creature of the media, I think that compels his aides to leak. They want to get their message out in the media. It's one of the main ways that they communicate with the president.
Interesting. I want to pick up on something that both David and Eliana said, talking about how there seems to be very little personal loyalty to Trump among the people who work for him, and at the same time, there doesn't really seem to be much of a program beyond the slogan. So, I think the big question for a lot of people around the world, and for a lot of Americans, is how did Trump win the election, given those deficiencies and well, given all of that, and any one of you can kick this off.
So he won in part because Hillary lost, and he won in part because all the smart people sitting on the stage here didn't understand, none of us did fully, that he understood something that many people didn't understand, that there was a group of voters who were ready to be mobilized, and he understood that they were there, and he had an idiom that appealed to them, and the fact that he so upset the elites made him even more irresistible to that voting group.
I think both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton helped him win in certain ways. So yes, Hillary Clinton lost. One of the questions that I'd be interested in your guys' thoughts is, would a different Republican candidate have beat Hillary Clinton, and would it have been by a larger margin? This is one of the things I go back and forth about in my head, but I think Obama represented, hope and sort of the promise of America, and his instinct, I think, was to blame problems when they came up on bigotry, and he would sort of at times he would tut-tut the American people and sort of remind them of, the better angels of our nature. I think Trump, in certain ways, was, a response to that. Hillary Clinton didn't do that as well as Obama, but Trump spoke to the people who, were angry, upset, were tired of, sort of tired of hearing that explanation, and they wanted to hear somebody talk about trade, somebody talk about, jobs disappearing, and he provided sort of alternative explanations for their problems. And a lot of people who I heard during the election or talked to, they would say, well, if you elect Trump, it'll be a disaster. And I think the people who elected him, the voters he spoke to, sort of, many of them looked at their lives and were like, this is a disaster. How, there's a huge opioid crisis in the country. Many of these people were Trump voters, and they thought, things are terrible, how can they get worse? We're going to take a chance on this guy. So I think that was part of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing that struck me from covered the primaries a little bit, what struck me a lot was how good Trump was at having a relatively simple message and kind of hammering away at it. And and as much as I think he's a very exceptional president for a lot of reasons on the policy front, I think in terms of the actual playbook that he employed during the election, it was it's something that we've seen over and over and over again. It's almost this classic populist playbook where I lived in Ralph Klein's Alberta, I lived in Rob Ford's Toronto, and the way that those guys won elections was very similar to the way that Trump won. And I wouldn't necessarily draw an equivalency between those people on the policy front, because I think, especially Klein, but even Rob Ford were sort of serious conservatives with a very sort of specific, purpose in mind and sort of policy agenda they were trying to enact. But in terms of the way they won, of go out and break all the rules and upset the elites and have a really sort of straightforward message and just kind of present yourself as a regular sort of man of the people. And sort of try to win by being everything that a typical politician is not, I think is the sort of thing that we've seen a lot, and it's not the sort of thing that most politicians can pull off, but many of them can.
I think also when this election is analyzed half a decade from now or a decade from now, when the incomprehensible will look inevitable. That's what our business is. We sit around saying what's going to happen, and then when something else happens, we say it was inevitable. I think this is a period of disruption, and we're in the newspaper business. Fortunately, we haven't been exposed to that. But most of the rest of the society, music, universities, the auto industry is about ready to go through this, and I suppose maybe eventually the newspaper business will be subject to this. It's a period of disruption, and this is the political equivalent of the iPhone, the political equivalent of the music disruption. And so I think partially it's that theme extended to the political arena, and partially I think Trump lives to make the New York Times staff go apoplectic. And if you look at what his policies are, they are designed not so much to be part of a discrete ideology. You tell me if I'm wrong here. Not so much to be part of a discrete ideology, because he's talking about taxes on the one hand and infrastructure spending of trillions of dollars on the other hand, but going right after climate change, going right after environmental regulations, going right after all sorts of regulations, opening national parks and stuff, questioning them. Those are designed to make the New York Times staff go mad. And by doing so, he wins approbation from his own group. And I actually think he lives to offend them.
Eliana, what do you think of that? That a big driver of Trump's popularity is this contrarianness. Is this if you may not know what you're for as a voter, but you know who you're against, you know which elites you don't like, and this is the guy to stand up to those people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think his his relationship with the media is one aspect of that. His constant insulting of the media, when in reality, there were two candidates of all the Democrats who ran, all the Republicans who ran, who had a reputation of hating the media. Hillary Clinton was one, and Donald Trump was the other. Hillary Clinton actually hated the press, and Trump loves the press, can't live without the press. But this rhetorical trope that he established of the fake news and the enemy of the American people, it's something that his base loves. It's contrarian, and I do think that there's sort of an epidemic in the U.S. of we have it on college campuses where people are sort of in a constant state of they're offended, they're sensitive. Trump is like a huge middle finger to all of that, and he offended the right people. I think he got a lot of approbation, and he garnered a lot of fans because he made the right enemies, which says nothing about whether he's the content of his views are correct.
But he made the right. When you say he made the right enemies, he made the right enemies for the voters he wanted to attract.
Right, ultimately to amass, a winning electoral coalition. But I think there were a lot of Republicans who were happy and ready to see, the Bush dynasty dethroned, for starters.
Tony, there isn't one person who lives on Trump's block in Manhattan who thinks that climate change is a fraud. There isn't one person in that block who thinks environmental regulations are bad. There isn't one person on that block who can go through every single thing. He is just there. He is, the phrase we used to hear is again the government. Well, he's again the government, and even as he is the government.
To what extent, though, I want to pick up on what Eliana said here, because I think it's important to try to understand the United States and possibly about what might happen in Canada. To what extent do you think his voters...
Kelly Leach subtweet?
Yeah, well, possibly. To what extent do you think his voters are very upset by what they perceive as social justice warriors or a kind of change in society that they don't want, and the fact that Trump is deliberately being insensitive to this, is deliberately trying to poke this, is part of what made him popular. I don't know what either one of you think on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly an element of that, and I think it's something that's existed in. in Canadian politics as much as in American politics for a long time, but there is this sort of, it's like the beleaguered white male, right? With these sort of, white dudes, like, just completely unaware of their privilege. Like, oh, we're so put upon by all these, feminists and these sensitive people who just, want this and that and whatever. And you've seen a lot of politicians who played to that very effectively over the years. I mean, the first George Bush, did a little bit of that in the late 80s, and I think Trump has just sort of has found a way to sort of amp that up even further, right? And to sort of say that, if you're particularly a white person who feels upset by all the discussion around police shootings or around identity politics, I'm going to tell you that you're not doing anything wrong. That it's actually all those other people who are who are in the wrong, and I'm going to go out and offend them all.
Let's talk a little bit about the Republican Party, because this has been the other, aside from the mystery of how Trump got elected, there's the mystery of how Trump actually, won the nomination and effectively took over the Republican Party and seemed to get the party to line up behind him. So, Eliana, you cover the Republicans, you cover the conservative movement. To what extent is the Republican Party, well, first of all, to what extent does the Republican Party exist, and to what extent is it lined up behind and supportive of the president?
Speaking of regulations and reforms, I think the party system and political parties have been weakened over time by a series of reforms that have increased the power of outside groups and super PACs at the expense of political parties. So I essentially think that the Republican Party exists kind of in name only. You have an R by your name that is it, and it's increasingly murky what that means or stands for. And if the Republican Party had any power, Donald Trump would not have been the nominee. The Democratic Party has preserved a little bit more power in that as Debbie, I guess this is the hacking of the Democratic Party, the DNC's email showed, they rigged the system, effectively. They were able to defeat Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton won, but that's a sort of power that political parties used to have that the Republican Party wasn't able to exercise. So, the party system now, I guess the Republican Party is basically an expression of the views of Republican primary voters, which is a far cry from what it used to be, where insiders were there so that people like Donald Trump didn't capture the nomination, so the people like Bernie Sanders didn't capture the nomination of a major political party. And, the party itself was, for the past 60 plus years, a vessel for the conservative movement, for conservative ideology. And it clearly is not that anymore. If 80,000 votes had gone in the other direction in a handful of states, there would be a huge, I won't say a national conversation, but a conversation on the right about what does the Republican Party stand for, what does the conservative movement stand for, because 78,000 votes went in a different direction. People really aren't having that conversation. But I do hear increasingly from lawmakers, particularly when the first attempt at health care failed, why aren't Republicans having this conversation? What do we believe in? What does this party stand for? And to what extent is conservatism, as it was conceived, in the mid-1950s, relevant anymore? So I think 2018 and 2020 will be a referendum on that, but I don't think you're seeing anybody making predictions about the sort of people who are going to get elected or what they believe in. I think what David said about there being an enormous disruption is true, and it's unclear exactly how this will impact the two parties in terms of what they stand for.
Will Rogers in the 1930s used to say, "I'm not a member of any organized political party, I'm a Democrat." I think that could be said now about Republicans. The Republican Party used to be really less a party than a fraternal lodge. It was Ronald Reagan's turn, and it was Richard Nixon's turn, and then it was Richard Nixon's turn twice, if you can believe that. And then it was Then it was Ronald Reagan's turn, and then it was George Bush's turn, and then, as incredible as it may seem, it actually was Bob Dole's turn. But that whole thing is gone now, totally gone. And the reason it's gone, and the reason that we are now, is the Republican Party used to be the party of the establishment. And there used to be an establishment within the party of the establishment. Well, there's no establishment anymore, and there's no establishment within the establishment party, so everybody's kind of adrift. And, I mean, if this had been a logical process in a normal year, we would be talking about President Bush.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, Jeb Bush would have won. Yeah, I mean, Jeb Bush was probably the most qualified Republican. You may feel differently. He had, it was his turn. He had a big state. He had experience. He had that nice little conservative, religious conservative element to him. He had the competence element to him. He was obliterated, and by Trump, who ridiculed him in the most merciless way.
One of the things that that some people thought as Trump was running, as Trump was ultimately elected, was at the end of the day, this will be a conventional Republican administration. Yes, he said all sorts of unconventional things as a candidate, but he won't really follow through on much of that. What you'll end up with is a conventional Republican administration. Thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry to interrupt. First of all, our notion of what a conventional Republican has changed an awful lot in the last 2 generations. The last conventional Republican president probably was Hoover. And that was a lot of fun to cover him, let me say. But Eisenhower wasn't a conventional Republican. He ran against the conventional Republican Taft and beat him. Nixon, when he became president, created the EPA, had a radical welfare program, which when it was appropriated by his Democratic opponent in 1972, George McGovern, he said it was communist, but it was okay when it was his idea. The war on, much of the war on poverty that Johnson started, Nixon was in some ways a very progressive Republican. Ford was a mainstream Rotary kind of Republican. Then you had Ronald Reagan, who completely reinvented Republicanism. And so there's no real traditional
When I say conventional Republican, though, I mean I'm starting with Reagan in the sense of a neoconservative. What we've had as the conservative movement for the last 20-something, 30-something years, and Trump has, in campaigning, blew a lot of that up. But a lot of people said, no, don't worry, he's not really going to change that much. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think the jury's still out on it, because I think part of the time I think that actually has come to pass, where a lot of the the more radical stuff that he said on the campaign trail, he's backed down from. I mean, the sort of big confrontation that the U.S. was going to have with China never materialized, and in fact, they've actually he's actually gotten along fairly well with Xi Jinping, and has decided, spontaneously, they're apparently not a currency manipulator anymore as of the last couple of months, and and to a certain extent on NAFTA as well. He hasn't, he had sort of a moment when he could have triggered the 6-month countdown clock to a withdrawal, and then back down, a couple of weeks ago. So I think, part of the time there is certainly that element. At the same time, though, he certainly hasn't gotten any more discipline since coming into office. He still behaves as president the way he did on the campaign trail, where it's midnight tweets and changing policy on a dime and coming out and saying something totally different than what everyone else's administration was saying the day before. And on top of that, too, you still do have that, the sort of nationalist, Steve Bannons and Millers and their sort of faction within the White House, who are there and who are trying to set policy and kind of have Trump actually follow through on a lot of the sort of more nationalistic stuff he campaigned on. So I think, it seems to me to be a live question that the guy's still sort of being pulled between the two poles.
And I'll give you a specific, well, actually, no, David.
Well, there was a great moment in the 1964 Republican convention when Barry Goldwater, who was the great radical conservative of his time, was giving his acceptance speech. And one wag turned to the other one and said, "My God, he's going to run as Barry Goldwater." Donald Trump is going to govern as Donald Trump.
Well, I'll bring up a specific, as I was thinking through what are examples of specific policies that conservatives might have been happier with in a year ago. Healthcare. It seemed to me that Donald Trump ran promising something very different on healthcare from the traditional conservative message, and yet what we've seen passed ultimately in the House looks to me like something different than what Donald Trump ran on. Your thoughts on that, Eliana?
I mean, what exactly do you mean by that? Because I think the same thing could be said on foreign policy, and I think this gets to the heart of the contradiction of Trump, who he had a real talent for marketing his policies. So on healthcare, he promised to repeal Obamacare. At the same time, he promised not to reform entitlements or take anything away from anybody. How do you reconcile those two things? On foreign policy, he promised to, bomb the blank out of ISIS and to go after terrorists much more aggressively than Obama had. At the same time, he promised to not to expend any American resources on needless wars, to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan. How do you reconcile those two things? I don't know. So I think that that cuts to the heart of your question. Now, what they've done, what the House has done on healthcare is not really a bill that any conservative, policy wonks I know think is a good bill. I don't really know anyone aside from, I guess, Paul Ryan or Trump himself who's come out and said, I really think this is a great bill. I guess part of that is par for the course. These things tend to be sort of legislative messes, but I don't think it's necessarily inconsistent with what he said at one point or another on the campaign trail, which is, it's a first attempt at, an Obamacare repeal.
Just briefly, what are all of your thoughts on whether or not Trump can actually get a healthcare reform bill repealing Obamacare and replacing it with something through both houses of Congress?
Well, I think the bigger hurdle was getting it through the House. I think Mitch McConnell has made very clear to him that he is not going to drive the process in the Senate. Mitch McConnell is going to be driving it. It's going to take a long time. And I'm relatively confident that that they'll get something done with Mitch McConnell driving the process. That said, I think the bill that comes out of the Senate and ultimately out of the out of the compromise process will be far more moderate than what came out of the House, simply because of the number of states that accepted the Medicaid expansion, and the Senate is just a much more moderate body than the House.
David, thoughts on this?
I agree. This is the House passed that bill so they can go home and say they passed a bill. Although some of them regret having done that. They were beat up pretty badly this week when they did go home. But the final product will be completely different, and it will be more like Obamacare than the system that preceded Obamacare, and that's because once you I think. You can interpret the United States history in one way. It's the history of the expansion of rights. And, we, of course, civil rights in the 1860s and again in the 1960s. You had Medicare in '65 and a whole bunch of other kinds of things that have come along. And you don't go back. I mean, think of it this way. Once air conditioning was invented, nobody said, well, we're not going to have air conditioning anymore. You just don't go back, and I don't think there's too much backpedaling in the American psyche right now.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I think this process has been so fraught and that it's such a giant mess is that Trump campaigned on repealing something that, essentially repealing an entitlement, and they're trying to do that without actually taking anything away from anybody. That's really, really, really difficult.
The other thing that I think a lot of people wonder about is to what extent the Republican Party will, and by Republican Party I guess I mean congressmen, senators, remain supportive of the president, or to what extent they are willing to oppose him on various things. And I think we have people even dreaming, Trump is going to be impeached at some point. What are your thoughts on that?
I hate to make another Rob Ford comparison because it seems a little bit lazy in this city, but I think, with Ford, you saw his support on city council, despite having had no councilors in his corner, sort of before he became mayor. You saw his support actually hold together, till about was a good like 3 years in, and it was you know, sort of long after, even after the, you know, the crack video came out. And I think but I think the reason for that was that a lot of people, and not just conservative councillors, I mean, you actually got this at the provincial level at Queen's Park as well. All three parties were terrified of his base, right? Where the guy caught lightning in a jar, you know, in a way that none of them had anticipated, and they were afraid that he was going to unleash that on them, you know, the moment they opposed him. And I get the sense that there's a similar vibe in Washington right now, where, you know, he did something that all these other Republicans, you know, still don't completely understand, and were completely unable to do themselves. And I think they're afraid that as soon as you cross that, you know, it becomes unpredictable, you know. So you might have a few sort of marginal people here or there, like, you know, blue state Republicans in, you know, New Jersey or California or Washington State or something, who, you know, who rely on independent, moderate voters who might be sort of more willing to break with the Trump administration. But it's hard to see this, you know, the majority of Republicans in Congress breaking with the president until you get to some point where it seems that he's so unpopular, he's lost enough of his base that there's no consequence to them electorally.
Yeah, impeachment or a huge kind of refugee crisis among Republicans is possible, but then again, it's not likely. Just as it's possible that the Maple Leafs could win the Stanley Cup someday.
Someday. Ileana?
Yeah,
not on the Leafs, on the Republicans.
Thank you. Yeah, well, impeachment is one end of the spectrum. You know, what the White House needs is wholehearted support from the Senate and from the Republicans in the Senate and the House. They did not have it during the campaign, and they don't really have it now. I mean, you saw Republicans in the Senate and the House coming out today and expressing grave concern about the fact that the president may have disclosed classified information to Russian officials. And I think there remains, a tense relationship between the White House and Capitol Hill. That's not unusual, but I think the way that the first attempt to pass a health care repeal played out exacerbated some of those tensions. And after that, I think that Paul Ryan was very happy not to have to drive the legislative process. I think they want the White House to do it because I don't think there's a tremendous amount of trust between Republicans on Capitol Hill and the Trump administration, and that's on the whole not a good thing. No, that doesn't mean they're going to impeach him, but on the whole, for him getting accomplished what he wants to get to accomplish, it's not good.
From the outside, you just said the word Trump administration, and it suddenly made me think, you know, from the outside, it often feels like there isn't a Trump administration. It feels chaotic. It feels profoundly unfinished. It feels unstaffed. To what extent is that the reality, and to what extent is that just perception?
I think that's absolutely true. And I think just as there's a lot of tension and distrust between Trump and Congress, he has some tension, and there's tension and distrust between Trump and his cabinet agencies and members of his cabinet even. And it's in part for that reason that many of the cabinet agencies remain largely unstaffed. Many of, Rex Tillerson at the State Department, Jim Mattis at Defense, they have butted heads several times with the White House staff over who can fill, senior posts in their departments, with the White House insisting on people who are loyal. And again, it's tremendously difficult to fill agencies with loyalists when there just aren't that many people who were A, competent, and B, loyal to Trump throughout the campaign. It really is a problem when you're choosing from Republicans. They don't want Democrats, and you're choosing from Republicans. And when you look at qualified Republicans, the vast majority of them were not Trump backers and were openly critical of Trump during the campaign.
I visited Washington a few weeks ago, and it struck me that it was like a city in occupation, almost like Vichy France. And Washington voted something like 85% against Trump. I mean, it's impossible, very difficult to find people in Washington who are congenial to the Trump administration, who feel that he's welcome. The notion that Trump could go to parents' night at Barron's school is almost incomprehensible. That the hostility toward him is amazing, and that it's a sense of a city under siege or being occupied right now. Do you have that sense?
Yeah, I think there's a sense of visceral hostility, disgust, condescension towards Trump and his family members. I don't think that's true of the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State. I do think that most members of his administration are well regarded, but there's certainly toward the Trump family and towards the president a sense of disgust and condescension.
I guess on a very practical level, you sort of pick up on it that it's hard for anybody on the outside to figure out exactly what the administration is doing or what it wants. And you see that all the time on, and it's not the largest file in Washington, but certainly on the trade file, where you go to people, whether it's people on the Canadian side or the Mexican side who are going to be doing the negotiations, or you go to people in industry who are going to be heavily affected by this, and they get frustrated that they go to the Trump administration and they can't figure out what they actually want in terms of, beyond the sort of general, the general sense of, more exports and things like that, what's actually going to be on the table. And I think that's sort of a sign of, it's like the lack of staffing, the fact that there are a lot of senior positions in commerce and in other places that just haven't been filled. B, a bureaucracy that's waiting for orders that haven't come yet, so sort of twiddling their thumbs, waiting to find out what's happening. And C, I think just sort of a disorganization at the top, in the sense that they haven't sort of laid out a fairly concrete notion of, here's 5 things or 6 things that we're going to put on the table that are going to be sort of our big demands. And it's, it's starting to get that, you get that sense even from the outside that, nobody can get an answer from the administration on, what they're actually trying to do.
I think also for a lot of us outside the United States looking at it, we're wondering, what's the state of the U.S. political system and the U.S. Constitution? And I kind of, 2 poles. At one pole you have everything's working perfect. This is exactly what the founders intended. The American political system is working perfectly. And at the other pole you have, my God, this is a disaster. The system's going to fall apart. And you have people like David Frum who say, that's where we're going. That's where it's headed. Where do you think the U.S. system is right now between, hey, it's business as usual, it's just a different president, and no, this is a very unusual time and a period of great danger?
Well, I think David Frum has successfully predicted 6 of the last 3 crises. It's a pretty resilient system. It's a pretty big country. It's fairly successful. It's better than Bulgaria, better than Romania, better than Belarus, better than Togo. It's pretty hard to ruin it, and I think it'll be okay.
I mean, it's a lot of. I guess there's a lot of sound and fury so far, but there hasn't been, like, the Trump administration hasn't, and maybe it's unfair to judge after 100 days, but they haven't actually done a lot of concrete stuff, right? And so there may be violations of norms, like firing the FBI director and telling Sergei Kislyak, what you're up to in Syria. But I think, but overall, you don't get the sense that there's a whole lot that they've actually done one way or the other. So far, it's sort of maybe a year from now we'll actually have a sense that they've done something. But right now, it's more in the noise, I guess, is what's abnormal than the actual policy.
I also think, we have a divided government. There are 3 branches of government and an enormous amount of focus on the executive branch. And as a result, I don't think we're hurtling towards a constitutional crisis. The power of the executive is limited, and there's only so much damage. Even if Trump were the embodiment of everything his enemies describe, the system is set up such that the amount of damage he could do is somewhat limited by design.
And also the amount of good he can do is limited as well. And other presidents have felt that frustration that they haven't been able to do good or to do well. You take Jimmy Carter, whose heart was pure, complete disaster. Ronald Reagan, who was an ingenue really, and took him 2 terms to get help, to get tax reform. And so it's a system that's built for stasis and frustration, which is why for us it's a jobs program.
Hear, hear. Let's talk about the one big issue for Canadians in terms of what Trump wants to get done and what Trump can get done in this frustrating system designed to frustrate a president. And that's, Adrian brought it up, it's trade, it's NAFTA. So, two big questions there. What do we think Trump actually wants to do? And two, what can he do, given that he only controls one of those levers of government?
Well, let me say that as somebody who studied history in college, it was the final exam question we all dreaded was, trace American tariff policies from 1929 to, this is a question that we all talk about. I'm going to say this behind her back. The only person who really fully understands this in all of Washington is Eliana Johnson. And I would say that, no, I'm serious. She wrote a piece in the National Review in October that was brilliant by any standards. And as I say, I would say it behind her back. I'm going to give you a lot of shuck and jive, but frankly, I don't know anything about this. So I'm going to defer to my friend here. It's remarkable that she's sitting to the left of me, but nonetheless, go ahead.
No pressure.
So I did write a piece, though I am not by any means an expert on trade policy, as fascinating as it would be if I was and could talk to you from that vantage point. But I think this election revealed, a political realignment in the realm of trade where the voters that identified as the most conservative, the most Republican, were also the most anti-trade, which is shocking, for not time immemorial, but since David began in journalism. The conservatives have been...
I spent 40 years being the youngest person around.
But conservatives have been a free trade party. For Reagan, it was part of his anti-communist stance that he thought free trade was, would fundamentally weaken the Soviet Union, and the more countries adopted it, the weaker the Soviet Union would become. But traditionally, it's taken a Democratic president and a Republican Congress to get any free trade bill passed. That's how Clinton passed NAFTA, and that's historically how things have been done. And I don't think that will be the case anymore. The way that this will align politically, I think it's becoming a much more regional issue. People's views tend to align with the region of the country that they're from than with what political party they're a part of. Then again, parties are regional too. So I don't think it's totally clear how the trade issue will shake out. But to go back to, how much damage can Trump actually do, or how much good can he actually do, depending on where you stand on the issue. Trump can say, I'm getting rid of NAFTA, but it actually takes Congress to undo a bill that was passed by Congress. And so the amount that Trump can actually do on a bill that was passed into law by a previous Congress is pretty limited. Now, he can have an impact. He said that he tossed TPP aside when he came into office. He can have an enormous amount of impact on future trade bills that are negotiated. But it's not clear to me that he is dead set on doing that. And I think we're not too far into the administration. One of the things that struck me, and I'm meandering a little bit here, but this really was a domestic policy election. But the way that it's shaped up in the first several months, it's really been a foreign policy presidency. And the way Trump is staffed up, he has real heavyweights on the foreign policy side. Not so much really on the domestic policy side. His White House aides, his head of domestic policy is 31 years old in the White House. And so part of me wonders if the significant developments in the Trump presidency will happen on the foreign policy side just by virtue of the way that the administration is staffed, at least right now, and that we won't see so much happen in the realm of trade, though just because of the shifting politics of it, I do think we'll see changes. But there needs to be cooperation between the executive branch and Congress for anything to get done, and traditionally that's been bipartisan cooperation.
I think that sometimes that like the thing that gets lost in trade is, when we talk about trade, or we talk about the American complaints about trade, are we talking about sort of small, discrete disputes like softwood lumber? And I mean, not to minimize softwood lumber, it's big, but it's a very specific dispute involving a specific industry and a specific, interpretation of different people's practices, or supply management or whatever. Or are we talking about the entire sort of overarching architecture of free trade? And I think, in some ways, the difficulty that the Trump administration has had is that, I think Donald Trump is has long been concerned about trade and has long felt that the U.S. is being taken advantage of. But it's often been in sort of either a very nebulous way or a very specific way, that there's, these sort of these particular practices that are bad. And I think it's an open question in the administration whether renegotiating NAFTA or renegotiating any of these trade deals is just about fixing very specific things that he thinks are wrong in them, whether it's softwood or the dairy industry, or whether it's actually about blowing everything up and putting in tariff walls and going back to mercantilism. And I think there are two factions within the White House, right? Where I think you've got you have the Bannons and people like that who very much kind of took Trump's concern about trade and I think attached it to their sort of larger idea of kind of a new economic nationalism. On the other side, you've got the Gary Cohns and the Steve Mnuchins, who I think want a more sort of limited renegotiation that basically just updates NAFTA and in a lot of ways is a conversation that the Canadians and the Mexicans are willing to have. And I think somewhere between those two poles is Wilbur Ross, who's the guy who's actually driving the bus, where he's you listen to him half the time, and what he's talking about is more market access, and and maybe he's and there's a little bit of bluster about Canada taking advantage of the U.S. on softwood lumber and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, he sounds like he ultimately just wants to make a deal that doesn't look all that different from TPP. The other half of the time, he talks about the economic nationalism stuff, and he talks about the trade deficit and how bad that is, and in a sense sort of talks about how he wants to basically get other countries to agree to buy more American products. Which I mean, to anybody following free trade, I can't imagine how you do that unless you're going to set up some sort of Mexican Politburo and Canadian Politburo that dictates exactly how many cars you buy from America every year. I mean, it's it's very and so I think that that's the knife edge that they're on right now is are they actually going to negotiate for for a big sort of complete blow up of NAFTA and a blow up of the international trading order, or are they going to be sort of talked down to just kind of dealing with a handful of kind of discrete issues like softwood lumber and the digital economy and these other sort of things that are at the end of the day are manageable.
I just ask both of the Americans on the panel here. For Canadians, trade has become probably the top of mind everyday concern when we look at the Trump administration. For you, covering it, following it in the United States, where is this on your list of priorities?
Well, I think the two most dreaded words in the reporter's lexicon are softwood lumber.
Ultra-filtered milk is a close second.
Right. I think if I were a reporter in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times and I heard those phrases, I would run to the hills.
Eliana, where's trade in terms of the interest of Americans and of Americans who cover the Trump administration?
Yeah, I was going to say, in David's parlance, doesn't sell a lot of copies, and in my parlance, doesn't generate a lot of clicks. So yeah, I don't think it's not something people are enormously concerned about or interested in.
James Reston once said that Americans will do anything about Latin America except read about it. Americans will do anything about software lumber except pay a lot of attention to it. Yeah. I mean, which isn't to say it isn't vital to both economies and all this kind of stuff.
David, you talked a moment ago about the fact that an administration is a presidency is limited in the harm it can engineer, but also in the good it can do. So I just want to briefly ask each of you, as you look at the future, what is your fear of of what can go wrong with the Trump administration, but what's your hope of what might actually go right in all this? And I know that's a very big question. Adrian, I'm going to put it to you first.
Well, I think for Trump there are two risks. I mean, one is the one that we all love to to speculate about, right? Which is what if he gets upset about ultra-filtered milk and bombs Ontario, right? I mean, I think there's there might be that notion that this guy just completely sort of circumvents constitutional protocols, or has his finger on the button and does something horrific. The other risk for for Trump, and I think this is probably what the Republicans would imagine is it might even be the more probable risk, is that he's completely ineffectual and he does nothing for 4 years, right? That all the drama, all the sort of craziness, that it takes up all the oxygen in the room. So not only is he not able to sort of push an agenda, but everybody spends all their time reacting to it, and it gives it gives the opposition, it gives the Democrats in Congress a sort of perfect reason to sort of monkey wrench and ensure the Republicans don't get anything done. So I mean, I think those are maybe the risks for the administration. The hope, I guess, is the level of civic literacy that this seems to have engendered. I mean, the fact that you can go to a bar in Toronto and you hear people talking about the minutia of who said what to the Russian ambassador in the room that day or whatever. It's amazing that people are paying this close an attention to politics, and I think that's and you could say the same, and and I'm not trying to be smug here. Like, you could say the same about Trump supporters, right? I mean, the fact that you've got all these people who many of whom haven't voted for a long time, or haven't felt disinvested in a candidate, but felt that there's something, as angry as they are, they feel there's something about America that's worth saving, and that they're willing to sort of, to engage in that. So I suppose that's the hope, that maybe there's some sort of, some sort of civic literacy that comes out of this moment that people carry forward.
I think that's a superb answer, but I would say that my greatest hope and greatest fear are distilled down to two words: North Korea.
Do you want to elaborate slightly on that?
Well, he could have a great success in North Korea, or it could be a catastrophe, and I don't know which way to bet on that. But it's the biggest crisis. President Obama told him it would be the biggest challenge he's going to have. It is the biggest challenge. I mean, it truly is a life or death challenge, and I don't think he's likely to bomb Ontario, or he's more likely to bomb Ontario, California, actually.
They didn't vote for him.
I think North Korea is a huge crisis, a huge challenge of the Cuban Missile Crisis caliber.
Eliana?
This isn't so much a hope, but I think Trump's his election revealed in a useful way that the people whose job it is, I won't name names, but we're sitting here, but the people whose job it is to understand the country and to talk to people about what's happening in the country don't actually really know that much about what's going on in the country. And I think he delivered a useful humbling that he very much likes to talk about, you may have noticed. And I think that was a good thing, and a much needed thing, and a useful reminder that you don't know as much as you think you know. And so I think that was good. My biggest fear is this is not a process-driven White House. A lot of White Houses, administrations in the past, they pass on processes from one to another. And there are times in which power accumulates to the executive. A terrorist attack is one. And so I guess my fear is that an event like that will happen when processes are important, and chaos will ensue.
I think a lot of us in the rest of the world, and that includes the government of Canada and Prime Minister Trudeau, sort of wonder how exactly they ought to react to the Trump administration. And there will be calls, there are many calls in Canada and other places, criticize the Trump administration, come out and criticize them boldly, treat the United States as almost becoming a pariah state. And there will be others who will say, hang on a second, keep quiet, stay out of the line of fire. To the two Americans, what can the rest of what can and should the rest of the world be doing right now?
They should be subscribing to a good newspaper.
Eliana?
Yeah, I think, I guess I think both of those reactions are somewhat peculiar. I mean, he's not all that complicated a guy, and I don't think, that human interaction is one thing that he seems to enjoy and that he excels at. And it doesn't seem to me that in his meetings with other world leaders, he's been tremendously difficult to deal with or to decipher. So I actually think, in the way that leaders approach each other, they study each other, they study each other's biographies and the way that they interact. And I think he's one of the simpler cases in that regard.
Xi Jinping would certainly agree with you.
Let me go to some questions from the audience. Question I'm wondering about myself. Can the Democrats win the Senate in 2018? And follow-up question, will this make a difference?
Defer to
Eliana?
I actually think that the Democrats have a greater chance of taking the House in 2018 than taking the Senate. They've thus far done a really impressive job of recruiting candidates for the House, which they didn't do at all in 2016. They did a horrific job, and they weren't able to capitalize on, what they might have been able to capitalize on, given that Trump was at the top of the ticket. I think the Senate presents a much more difficult landscape. I think Mitch McConnell is a pretty formidable adversary, but I would give them greater odds of taking back the House. And will it make a difference? I mean, I don't know that the Republican House would be, I honestly think that the Democrats' goal should be to decrease the Republican margin in the House, because that's really all they need to do. There are enough Republicans in the caucus that cause Paul Ryan, that give him serious headaches, that if the Democrats succeed at picking off enough seats, I think that will make a real difference in terms of Paul Ryan's ability to push legislation through the House. Would have made a difference on the health care bill. It ended up passing by a handful of votes.
Well, parties of power tend to lose support in the Congress and the midterm elections. I think this one will as well, but I'm not sure that either chamber will change party control. And I think Trump will feel that if that doesn't happen, he'll claim that itself was a huge victory. You'll see a pattern here. Everything's a big victory. And I think that that's what's going to happen. I think that they'll lose some in both houses, but he'll retain power in both, and that Trump will declare victory.
Given the recent news with Russia, and none of us have been on Twitter in the last 35 minutes, so there may be more. But given the recent news in Russia, under what conditions could Trump be impeached? And I do think this is something that a lot of people, a lot of Trump opponents in the United States and elsewhere are constantly thinking about. Is impeachment coming? How could it come? When could it come? Under what conditions could it come?
Okay, we've only gone through impeachment twice. We've gone through it 3 times, but only two presidents have been impeached. It is a fearful, fearsome process. It marks and defines and warps the lives of everyone involved. The Clinton impeachment was a searing experience for the system and for the country and for the lawmakers involved. I don't think that a Republican Congress is going to impeach a Republican president, though it did in 1868. But this isn't 1868 anymore. I think it's exceedingly unlikely that he'll be impeached. I know a lot of people are hoping so. There's already a book out about it. There is. Lawrence Tribe, who's a distinguished law professor at Harvard, is talking about impeachment. But it's the kind of thing that people talk about without doing. And I think it's a fearsome, horrible process that is a terrible thing for the country to go through, and I don't think it will happen.
I actually asked David about this when I walked in tonight because, he rode around on the plane with Bill Clinton, and the question that I asked him was, do you think Democrats are laying the groundwork for impeachment in their calls for a special counsel, and did they, are they following the playbook that Republicans used in the 90s? My sense is that they are. I think that they don't actually think that there's going to be a special counsel appointed on this Russia stuff, but that in calling for it, that they're looking to lay the groundwork for impeachment should they recapture the House, or should they recapture the House and the Senate at some point in the next 4 or 8 years. That said, I don't think it's likely to happen, but I do think that that's what they that's their long-term play.
If you play that out, it'll be interpreted by a lot of people as the elites trying to overturn an election, fairly won election. And I think Democrats are not in the position to risk that accusation. I just don't. I think it's too dangerous for them. They would love to do it, but only if they can succeed. It's that old thing: you should attack the king only if you can kill him. I don't think they can kill him metaphorically. I must add, and I think that they'll pull back from that. I just don't think it'll happen.
That's like further to what we were talking about earlier about Trump's base of support, right? I mean, it's still such a phenomenon, and it's still so recent that, you think of Republicans, I think, are terrified of Trump's base. There's a lot of Democrats who are too, because these are people that, that potentially could go either way. So, yeah, as you said, I mean, I think it's difficult to imagine anybody sort of breaking ranks, particularly this early on.
So, here's another question. If Trump survives 4 years, could he be there for another 4? And David, we were talking about this. We were all talking about this just before in the room, that Trump's approval ratings are really quite low compared to any other president early in his term, but they're in the same ballpark as where Bill Clinton was in the spring and summer of his first term. So if Trump survives 4 years, are another 4 years possible?
Sure, it's possible. It's no less unlikely than Trump being elected himself for the first time.
Eliana?
I don't have anything to add to that. I think certainly his election in November took a lot of us out of the business of political forecasting. Certainly that far in the future.
My wife says that I was the guy who thought Gary Hart would be a 2-term president. I'm the wrong guy to ask.
Yeah, no, sorry. It's a cop-out, but yeah, too soon to tell. I mean, I think it's also an open question to what extent Trump's victory was a product of a specific moment and a specific set of circumstances and the particular candidate he was running against, and how much it's indicative of an actual shift, of some change that he can capitalize on again in 4 years. Right? I mean, I think it seems that everybody is banking that it is something larger than that it actually is something that can sustain him for another election. But I don't think you'll know until these 2 or 3 years from now.
I used that 2-term election gag on something that was on television. I guess it was on one of those public affairs things that I can't imagine anyone watches, but Gary Hart did watch it. And about 4 or 5 days later, I get a letter from Denver, and it opened up and says, "Dear David, I should have been a 2-term president."
And there's a second part to this question. And the second question is about the possibility of a President Ivanka Trump, and I think a lot of people do wonder about this: is whether the Trump family has legs as a political media dynasty, and someone's already shrugging at that.
I mean, come on, political dynasties. You don't have any in Canada, for example. I mean, you have no experience. We only had 2 presidents: Roosevelt, 2 presidents Adams, 2 presidents Bushes. 2 nominees, Clinton. You've had 2 Trudeaus. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't British Columbia have 2?
2 Bennetts.
2 Bennetts, yeah. There aren't a lot of Americans who can tell you that. So I mean, so it's ridiculous. Just like the notion of a prime minister, yeah. But it's ridiculous in other ways too.
Want to get in on that?
Suffice it to say that I don't think she would attract the same coalition as her father, but maybe a different one.
Better dressed.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another question. Does Donald Trump know exactly what he's doing, or does he have no idea at all what he's doing?
I think he has. I think he has a vague notion, and I think a big part of it is, like, a big part of what's happening, I think, in his administration is people sort of, trying to graft their notion of what he should be doing onto his kind of preconceived ideas. I mean, we talked about this with trade, right? Where I think he's legitimately upset about some, specific trade, policies, and you have some people who say within the administration who say, well, let me divert that into, let me attach economic nationalism to that and sell that to the president as the solution. But you have other people in the administration who I think are trying to divert him to basically just be a sort of conventional Republican president who will just sort of pass Obamacare repeal and the kind of things that that they want. So I think he has a general idea, but I don't think he's particularly great on the specifics.
My interpretation of that question goes to, and don't interpret this the wrong way, but it's like, is sort of psychoanalytic. Like, I think he does things that are, he's guided by instinct, and I think at times, I don't know if it's intentional, but people ask, on the campaign, for example, people would say, oh my gosh, Republicans would say, every time Hillary Clinton makes a mistake, Trump does something stupid and it eats up, what would have been a terrible news cycle for her. And similarly now, Republicans passed the health care bill and Trump stepped in it and fired James Comey. There's something inherent in him that, I don't know if it's conscious, but he fills, he fills every space he's in. He constantly manufactures crises. That just is who he is, whether it's intentional or not. And it is, he's not going to change. Does he know what he's doing? It depends. It depends. What is he doing? No, really. I mean, what is he there to do? I'm not sure. If you asked him, I don't know you'd get a straight answer from him. But yeah, if his answer is, if the answer to what he's doing is making the New York Times editorial board hysterical, he's doing a really good job of it. If the answer is, becoming the preeminent conservative policy wonk, he's not doing a very good job. But I think it really depends on what your understanding is of what his goal is. And I don't think his goal is to become a policy wonk. I think his goal is really to upend the system and drive a lot of people, and to drive a lot of people to get their smelling salts.
David, you want to add to that? What is the most positive initiative that you feel that Trump has undertaken in his first 100 days? Tick, tick.
I think people think Syria. Syria was a good thing. His address in front of the joint session was a positive good. He's brought attention, and I think actually your answer is the most eloquent too, is that he has really increased news literacy and raised a lot of important questions, really a lot of important questions about what is news, who defines news, who are the adjudicators in American culture. Those are very, very important questions that Barack Obama never raised. Bill Clinton, for all of his cerebral talents and his ability to do the New York Times crossword puzzle and pen in an hour, never raised those questions. These are vital questions that we as a country never faced. The nature of our civic debate, whether manners matter. He's not asking these questions, but he's making these questions at the center of American life. And if Natasha Hassan is in the room, I think this is the beginning of an op-ed for next week. Yeah. He's making us confront questions that we have not confronted in a generation.
I think I'll just follow on to what you said, and I think it's the reason I think that the questions he's raised are so interesting is that they're questions on which the right and the left in the U.S. are so often at loggerheads, but on which I think they can actually find commonality. One example that springs to mind is Trump's election has made many people on the left say, we need a common set of facts. Where is truth? We need to have some kind of common conversation, and it was so much better when we had, 3 news channels, ABC, NBC, CBS. At the very least, everybody had to watch the same thing. And it occurred to me that conservatives for some time had been making a similar argument, but it was limited to college campuses where they said, there's some good in having everybody read the same sorts of things on college campuses. Doesn't so much matter. Their arguments tended to be that people should read the great books, but I've heard a lot of conservatives say it doesn't matter what it is, but that people in a discrete community on a college campus, they should be able to get to know each other and have something to talk about as students, have a central reference point. And it seemed to me that Trump sort of broadened that out, and I heard liberals start to say, we need a common reference point around which to have a conversation. David mentioned manners, and it seemed to me that I had heard liberals say many times, they're the product of a patriarchy, and social norms are forced on people, and it seemed like it was something that I had identified, at least in my mind, more with conservatives. And then when Trump brought it on the national scene, I saw liberals recoil from it. And I do think that the product of this, I don't really know if it's possible, could be, something of a meeting of the minds around these sorts of things.
When I was a freshman at Dartmouth College, many years ago, the notion was that every freshman at Dartmouth should, where your sister and father went, should read Paradise Lost. Well, today, the phrase Paradise Lost on a college campus is usually referred to as election day in 2016. But I still think there's something very important to have a common knowledge, and these don't only have to be Western. They in fact should be extremely diverse, but people should have a common denominator upon which to make their judgments. And we have now a society, in the United States at least, and I can't speak for Canada, but we have where there is no common denominator, where people talk past each other. Eliana and I were talking earlier today, where it's possible for people who support Trump to say they do not know anyone who opposes him, and it is surely possible for people who say they do not support him to say, I don't know anyone who voted for him. And there was a great story from the Adlai Stevenson campaign where some woman came up to Governor Stevenson after he lost the election and said, I can't believe you lost. Everybody I know voted for you.
Do you feel like that is changing in America, that polarization, or did this election actually entrench and deepen it?
I think it's a very dangerous part of American life. I think that when Eliana was writing for National Review, no liberals read it, and the readers of National Review did not read the New Republic, and the readers of the Washington Post editorial page did not read the Wall Street Journal editorial page. It's much worse than ever before, than has been in several generations. We're beginning to have a partisan press as we had before the turn of the 20th century. It's a very serious problem. I think it's our biggest social and cultural problem, is that we live in two worlds.
I'm going to give the last word to Adrian. Positive actions of the Trump administration, or potentially positive things that come out of the Trump administration's actions.
Yeah, I mean, beyond the civic literacy thing, I mean, the one thing that I think Trump has often done is he's taken the kinds of things that all politicians do and amp them up to some unimaginable degree. And I think, and I think in a lot of ways the sort of the phenomenon of sort of, you know, making up facts or playing fast and loose with facts. It's the sort of thing that just about all politicians do, and just about all politicians, you know, even covering Queen's Park, you'd have people who would, you know, either deliberately, you know, mislead you, if not attempt to outright lie to you, and do it in this sort of, you know, but they'd always sort of do it in a very kind of clever or sort of roundabout way, so that they could, you know, they could deliberately attempt to sort of sow, you know, doubt, you know, among the people who were listening to them, and I think to a certain extent, Trump has just sort of spotlighted that, and kind of spotlighted how easy it is, right? And how easy it is that you can, you know, you can say that that this empty field is full of people and is a large, you know, the largest inauguration crowd of, you know, in the history of inaugurations. And I think, you know, and I think that that's the positive thing that could come out of it is that there could be some sort of soul searching, whether it's among, you know, voters in terms of sort of, you know, how you question what a politician is telling you, or how you know, how you understand, you know, how you understand and fact check things, or if it's among politicians themselves to, you know, to hopefully have some sort of, you know, wake up call, I guess, that that it isn't, you know, Trump didn't invent lying in politics, you know, and he certainly didn't invent obfuscation and misleading people. You know, politicians have been doing this for a long time, and it's, you know, whether it's a left, right, or center, they all kind of engage in it, and so I would hope that they would, you know, that they would sort of look within themselves and see that you know, any politician who's engaged in this sort of thing, no matter how small, has sort of contributed to this to a certain extent.
I just wanted to add something, and I'm not totally unbiased because I do write for the Globe and Mail, but let me also say that you're very, very lucky in this community and country to have a newspaper like this. And I made a lot of jokes on the course. That's true. And I made a lot of jokes in the course of this evening about the newspaper business and how we are impervious to the other forces and all this kind of stuff. But you travel to other cities in this. I know it's a national newspaper, but it's based here, and you all live in Toronto. You travel across North America, and you look at the state of journalism and the state of newspapers in particular. You're very, very lucky to have a newspaper like this, and I just want to thank you for inviting us. But it's part of the answer is what we're doing tonight.
Hear, hear. On that note, and with that plug, I'm going to metaphorically bring down the curtain. Thank you all for your brilliant questions. Thank you to our panelists for being here.